Good day, class. Today we begin a very important topic that ties together everything we've discussed so far about community, environmental, and occupational health, which is One Health. So after we finish One Health, we'll move into our second major topic for this lesson, which is Universal Healthcare or UHC and how it's implemented here in the Philippines. So before we start, I want you to keep one question in mind throughout this discussion. Can we truly protect human health while ignoring the health of animals and the environment around us? So let's find out together as we progress with our discussion. So, what exactly is One Health? Before I give you the textbook definition, let's think about recent events. Remember COVID-19? Where did that likely originate? From an animal source that eventually infected humans. Remember bird flu outbreaks affecting poultry farms? These are not isolated animal problems, they are public health problems. So One Health is the framework that formally recognizes this connection. So let's look at the full definition on the next slide. According to One Health High-Level Expert Panel or OHHLEP in 2021, One Health is defined as an integrated unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. So take note of three important words here. We have integrated, unifying, and sustainably balanced. This is not simply human health plus animal health. It's about recognizing that these are one interconnected system. So the definition continues, it recognizes that the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment, including ecosystems, are closely linked and interdependent. So this is the citation coming from OHHLEP 2021. Okay? So let's think about the recurring dengue outbreaks in Davao City after heavy rains and flooding. So stagnant water, which represents the environment. Stagnant water breeds Aedes mosquitoes. The Aedes mosquitoes are now the vector or the animal, which then infect people. People are, it refers to human health. Or consider leptospirosis cases that spike after flooding in low-lying barangays. So rodent urine, it is the animal reservoir, contaminates flood water. The flood water now is the environment, which then enters human wounds or mucous membranes, and that represents the human health. So, uh, in which both of those examples are One Health problems happening right here in Davao City and maybe all over the world. Okay, so here on our next slide, it gives us a very clear comparison table. So on the left, we have the global health approach, which prioritizes human health. In the middle, we have veterinary health, which prioritizes animal health. And on the right, we have One Health, which co-prioritizes human, animal, and ecosystem health together. So notice the three overlapping circles, a hand representing ecosystem or environment, a person representing health, human health, and a goat representing animal health. So let's walk through example one. We have here antimicrobial resistance or AMR. So under the global health approach, AMR is tackled by limiting antimicrobial drug used in hospitals only. Under veterinary health, AMR in animals is tackled by limiting antimicrobial use in livestock only. But under One Health, AMR in humans is tackled by limiting both animal drug use and environmental contamination while also accounting for the socio-ecological and cultural determinants of overuse. So do you see the difference now? One Health looks at the whole picture, not just one silo. So now, example 2, notice how poor mental health among pastoralists, livestock herders is viewed differently. So the global health approach attributes it simply to low income. The veterinary health approach attributes to low income to high mortality among livestock, but the One Health approach connects the dots completely. Poor mental health is attributed to high rates of livestock disease and death, which leads to loss of livelihoods, which then affects mental well-being. So this shows how One Health captures causal chains that siloed approaches miss. So here in Davao region, I'll give you an example. So hog raisers affected by African swine fever or the ASF outbreaks experience exactly this chain. So the livestock deaths and mandatory culling led to lost income for backyard racers in areas like Davao del Sur and Davao de Oro, which in turn created real psychosocial and financial stress for farming families. Okay, so similarly, if you recall, um, let's say for instance, a thesis panel review on Salmonella species in flies from Bangkirahan Public Market. So that study is a live example of the AMR or food safety logic in our example 1. So the flies are moving between waste, then produce and meat stalls. No, they create a same interconnected transmission risk that a hospital-only approach would never catch. Okay, now it's important for us to recognize that One Health is not a new idea invented by Western science. So indigenous people around the world have practiced these interconnected worldviews for centuries, long before the term One Health was coined. For example, indigenous people across Canada are unified in their belief that the well-being of an individual is directly connected to the well-being of the land. That's from Hillier and colleagues in 2021. So the indigenous people of the Kalahari in southern Africa are well known for their profound connection with their land, their intimate knowledge of the natural world, and the delicate balance they have maintained for millennia with the environment. So it's according to Survival International 2022. And in Andean and Amazonian indigenous cultures, there's a beautiful concept called Suma Kausai, or good life, in the Quechua village, an indigenous principle promoting living in harmony with nature to achieve well-being for all. This is from Pachamama in 2022. So the point here, my dear students, is One Health formalizes in scientific language a wisdom that indigenous communities have always known and lived by. So, let's say in the context of the Philippines, in Davao, for example, so we don't have to look overseas for this. So, our own Philippine indigenous peoples, which are the Lumad communities of Mindanao, no, including the Bagobo, the Tagabawa, and Matigsalug groups here in Davao region, they hold strong ancestral domain concepts of kinship with the land, the forests, and the rivers. So their traditional practice of sustainable Sweden or kaingin, rotation and forest stewardship, guided by respect for both nature and ancestral spirits, reflects the same interdependence emphasized by One Health. You may also mention the Ifugao Rice Terraces, which is a UNESCO World Heritage site built on a centuries-old irrigation and forest conservation system. So the Moyong Forest Zones that sustainably balances human agriculture with ecosystem health. Now that we understand what One Health is and where it comes from, let's talk about how it is actually implemented. So this next section covers the key competencies and underlying principles that turn One Health from a nice idea into an actionable practice. So there are four underlying principles necessary to implement a One Health approach. So let's go through each one briefly. We will unpack each in more detail over the next few slides. So first, the paradigm shift. So this involves environmental stewardship and recognizing anthropogenic or human cost, drivers of disease, and ecological harm. Second, we have systems thinking. It is a holistic approach to understanding the problem as a whole system rather than isolated parts. Third, we have multi-sectoral and inter or transdisciplinary responses, integrating diverse knowledge forms from different sectors and fields of expertise. Fourth, we have socio-political and multicultural parity, so gender-responsive and human rights-based approaches that ensure fairness and inclusion. Okay, so those are our four key areas that form part of our One Health implementation. Now let's zoom in into the first principle, which is the paradigm shift. So this requires people to reconnect with indigenous ways of life and reduce the level of extraction and destruction of natural resources by recognizing five key truths. So one, we are part of a complex adaptive ecosystem, so not separate from it or above it. Then two, our health is directly dependent on ecosystem's health. If the ecosystem is sick, we will eventually get sick too. So three, our presence on this planet is more about belonging than conquering. We are guests, not owners. Four, our role is stewardship rather than ownership. So we are caretakers, not rulers of the environment. And then five, we must work with the natural evolutionary and ecosystem processes to enhance life on Earth rather than exploit and degrade them. So let me give you an example. Think of illegal logging and mining in upland areas of Davao region, contributing to landslides and flash floods in downstream barangays. A mindset of conquering nature for short-term profit. Compare this to community-based forest management programs and mangrove reforestation efforts along the Davao Gulf coastline, which reflect the stewardship mindset uh, this slide describes. Okay. Our second principle is systems thinking. So on this slide, uh, we see a journal citation from Hitziger and colleagues in 2021 titled System Thinking and Citizen Participation is Still Missing in One Health Initiatives. So these are lessons from 15 evaluations. Even though systems thinking is recognized as essential, real-world programs often still fail to apply it fully. That's an important gap to be aware of. So what does systems thinking actually mean? So we have three definitions given here. First from Straw in 2015 and Arnold and Wade in 2015. So we have developing an understanding of the workings of a system to better understand its purpose and predict its behavior. And if necessary, how that behavior can be influenced for the better. Second, from Meadows in 2009, recognizing the relationship between a system structure and its behavior and outcomes. In other words, how something is organized determines what happens. Third, from Chapman in 2015, an understanding of how complex systems behave using a holistic approach called holism that aims to include multiple perspectives called pluralism. So the diagram on this slide from OHHLEP in 2022, it shows the One Health wheel. So sectors and disciplines like environment, animals, and human converging with society, rural, urban, mobile communities, local, national, regional, and global levels, all connected through communication, collaboration, coordination, and capacity building at the center, working toward healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, and healthy humans. Our third principle is multi-sectoral and inter- or transdisciplinary responses. So this slide shows two powerful visuals side by side. One on the left is a stakeholder mapping diagram from Hayes and colleagues in 2021. Centered on a dairy cattle producer, notice how many different stakeholders connect to this one central figure. So we have the government vets, the private vets, biosecurity officers, transport agents, abattoir, We have feed agents, we have AI, technicians, we have milk processors, rural bankers, farm consultants, local council representatives, and even hobby farmers and animal welfare groups. So each connection has a type. So we have positive, negative, or neutral relationship, and strong, weak, or one-directional influence. So this shows just how many sectors must coordinate for a single One Health issue, animal disease control, to work. So on the right is an interdisciplinary network map from Humboldt, Dacruden, and colleagues in 2020. This is essentially a word cloud network showing how research topics cluster and connect. Epidemiology, surveillance, we have zoonosis, AMR, climate change, biodiversity, wildlife, ecology, and community all interlinked around the central concept of one health and one medicine. So the bigger and more central a term appears, the more it functions as a hub connecting different disciplines. So picture an actual outbreak response here in Davao City. So say an avian influenza scare in a poultry farm in Panabo or Carmen. So the response wouldn't just involve the Bureau of Animal Industry, it also requires the City Veterinarian's Office, the DA Regional Field Office 11. Now we also have the DOH Davao or the CHO Davao for human health surveillance. We also have the DENR for environmental concerns. We also have the LGUs for movement control and quarantine, and even Market Vendors Association at Bangkerohan or Agdao markets to control product movement. So that's multi-sectoral response in action. So mirroring the stakeholder map on this slide. Our fourth and final underlying principle is socio-political and multicultural parity. So achieved through rights-based approaches. So the citations here are Redverse and colleagues in 2022 and Garnier and colleagues in 2020. So this principle reminds us that One Health cannot be implemented fairly if we ignore gender, culture, indigenous rights, and human rights. So a truly effective One Health program must be gender responsive, considering how health risks and access to resources differ between men and women, and must respect the rights and knowledge systems of indigenous and marginalized communities rather than imposing top-down solutions. So in many Davao region upland communities, women and children are often the ones fetching water and are therefore more exposed to waterborne zoonotic risks, while men may have greater occupational exposure to livestock during herding or slaughter. So a rights-based One Health program would design interventions such as hygiene education, PPE provision, vaccination scheduling, that account for these gendered exposure differences, and would consult Lumad community leaders and traditional structures rather than bypass them. We move into the applied portion of our discussion. So we'll look at two major real-world case studies where One Health thinking is essential. First, emerging zoonotic epidemics and pandemics, and second, later in the lesson, antimicrobial resistance. So both are deeply tied to how our global food systems operate. So this timeline sourced from Rural 21-2020 shows significant emerging zoonosis outbreaks over the past 30 years, so from 1990 up to 2020. So let's walk through it chronologically. In the 1990s, we have BSE or the mad cow disease drove major changes in feeding practice regulations and had a decades-long impact on the British beef economy, increasing calls for traceability. Also in the 1990s, Hendra virus was first isolated at the horse racing stables in Australia. And interestingly, the equine Hendra vaccine became an early example of a One Health approach since vaccinating horses helped protect the humans who work closely with them. Around 2000, Nipah virus emerged from the coexistence of extensive mango farming and intensive pig farming, which drove spread between bats, pigs, and humans in Malaysia. Also around this time, Marburg virus outbreaks were frequently associated with human exposure to bat-inhabited caves or mines. In the mid-2000s, we have SARS emerged linked to the consumption of exotic or wild animals in wet markets. So around the same period, We have S. suis infections in pigs. We have processing practices led to infection with strains of commensal bacteria in pigs that severely sicken farmers. By 2010, we have H5N1 posed a shock to the global economy and food supply, impacting the poultry sector, feed suppliers, restaurants, and tourism. Also, H1N1, needless pig culls and economic losses due to panic and misinformation. So we also have by 2015, Ebola disrupted local food supply and was driven partly by increased human contact with wildlife. Zika, linked to commercial farming practices, may have contributed to outbreaks in Brazil. MERS was initially associated with camels in Saudi Arabia, later spreading to South Korea with wide-reaching economic impacts, especially on tourism. So, and by 2020, we have COVID-19. Necessary containment methods threaten global food supply and food security worldwide. So, do you notice a pattern? Nearly every single one of these outbreaks traces back to human interaction with animals, whether through farming intensification, wildlife, wildlife trade, or habitat encroachment. So this diagram from UNEP and ILRI in 2020, it illustrates the pathogen flow at the wildlife-livestock-human interface. So picture three concentric circles. So the outer circle is the biosphere. The next layer is the domestic landscape. And within that landscape, we have three overlapping zones. We have humans, livestock, and peri-domestic wildlife. So animals like rats or mice that live close to human settlements. Meanwhile, true wildlife exists in its own separate circle but interacts with this domestic landscape. So the arrows in the diagram show bidirectional pathogen exchange. We have wildlife can transmit pathogens to peri-domestic wildlife, which connects to both humans and livestock. And humans and livestock also exchange pathogens directly with each other. So this is essentially a visual map of how spillover happens. So pathogens don't respect the boundaries we draw between wild, domestic, and human spaces. So this is exactly the pattern behind Nipah virus over spillover in Southeast Asia. So in which fruit bats, which is found in the wildlife, drop partially eaten fruit that pigs or livestock consume. And farm workers, representing the humans who handle sick pigs, then become infected. So a more local parallel is rabies transmission in Davao barangays. So we have stray or unvaccinated dogs. So we have peri-domestic wildlife adjacent animals interacting with community animals and children, which is why the City Veterinarian's Office anti-rabies vaccination drives are a direct, practical, One Health intervention at exactly this interface. Okay, so we now zoom into one specific detailed case study. We have avian influenza or AI. This is presented as a build-up casual loop diagram across the next several slides. So each slide adds one more layer. So on the first step, we see two starting drivers. We have human population growth and socioeconomic improvement. So both arrows point toward a single outcome. So higher demand for animal source food. This makes intuitive sense as populations grow and as people's incomes improve, more people can afford and want meat, eggs, and dairy. Now we add the next link, which is higher demand for animal source food leads to increasing intensification of poultry production. In other words, to meet the rising demand, poultry farms scale up, more birds, packed more densely, produced faster. Okay, so the next box appears, vulnerability to AI or avian influenza, described in parentheses as genotypically similar, concentrated population, stress conditions. This flows from increasing intensification of poultry production. Think about why, when you have thousands of genetically similar birds crowded together under stressful farming conditions, a virus that infects one bird can spread through the entire flock almost instantly, and the bird's immune systems are already compromised by stress. So this mirrors commercial poultry operations across Mindanao, so including parts of Davao region where broiler and layer farms operate at high density to meet urban demand from Davao City and nearby provinces. So the same principle, genetic uniformity plus crowding plus stress equals outbreak vulnerability, is precisely why uh, Department of Agriculture biosecurity protocols require strict farm level controls. Now we branch back to human population growth, which also drives intensification of agronomy and land use change for cereal production because more people also need more grain, including grain used as poultry feed. This new branch then also feeds into increasing intensification of poultry production, reinforcing the same pathway from its second direction. Here's where the diagram becomes a genuine feedback loop. Both human population growth and intensification of agronomy and land use change for cereal production point toward climate change. So this shows that climate change is not separate from food production. So it's a direct consequence of these same underlying drivers. Climate change now leads to loss of wild bird habitats, which in turn causes a change in wild bird migration patterns. This is a critical ecological consequence. Wild birds are the natural reservoir of avian influenza viruses, so when their habitats shrink or their migration routes shift, they may come into closer, more frequent contact with domestic poultry and human settlements than before. Now, both pathways converge, change in wild migration patterns and vulnerability to avian influenza from our earlier poultry farm branch, both feed into a highlighted box, which is increasing frequency of AI outbreaks. So this is the diagram's central tipping point. Notice it's shaded differently from the rest of the diagram to draw the eye, since this is the pivotal consequence the whole chain has been building toward. Finally, we see the downstream consequences that radiate outward from increasing frequency of AI outbreaks. First, risk of spillover to humans, meaning the virus can jump from birds to people, sometimes with serious or fatal outcomes. Second, culling of stock, disinfection, and delay in restocking, so the necessary but economically painful response to contain an outbreak. Third, flowing from that culling response, so undermining food and nutrition security because mass culling removes a major protein source from the food supply, especially painful in already food insecure communities. So if we trace the entire diagram from beginning to end, population growth and rising income drive food demand and agricultural intensification, which drives climate change and farming vulnerability, which increases outbreak frequency, which then threatens both human health and food security. This is a perfect, complete illustration of why One Health thinking is necessary. So a single human socio-economic trend, if left unmanaged, cascades all the way to a public health and food security crisis. So let me give you an example. So the H5N1 avian influenza detections in backyard and commercial poultry in parts of the Philippines in recent years, prompting the DA calling operations and temporary poultry product bans in affected provinces. So followed exactly this chain. So local consequences mirror the diagram. We have farm gate losses for racers, temporary egg and breast chicken price spikes in markets like Bangkerohan, and public health surveillance activated by DOH and DA working together, real-life multi-sectoral One Health response. Our second major food systems case study is antimicrobial resistance or AMR, a topic in which you've likely heard before. So now we'll examine it fully through the One Health lens. Let's start with the definition. AMR occurs when any microorganism such as fungi, bacteria, virus, or parasite develops resistance to known antimicrobial treatments, including antibiotics, antifungals, and antimalarials. So here's a critical relationship to remember. AMR is proportional to the amount of antimicrobial used per person or per livestock animal. So unregulated or excessive use in humans and livestock, aquaculture, and agriculture accelerates the emergence and transmission of AMR genes by exerting what's called selective pressure on resistant strains. So meaning, the antimicrobials kill off the susceptible microbes but leave the resistant ones to survive and multiply. Now, let's talk numbers. So from O'Neill in 2016, AMR caused 5 million deaths in 2019. And this is predicted to increase to 10 million deaths by 2050 if the current trends continue. So AMR infections also cause increased spread to the community. The economic cost is staggering. So increased treatment costs and duration means AMR could cost anywhere from 300 billion to more than 3.4 trillion US dollars annually by 2050 worldwide. And of course, AMR leads to increased morbidity and mortality from infectious disease in general. So I have a thought to ponder to you, my dear students. If antibiotics kill bacteria, why does using more antibiotics eventually make infections harder to treat? Okay, so please think of that. Now, let's look specifically at how AMR relates to animal-sourced food systems. Total antimicrobial consumption in animals across 228 countries is estimated at 63,151 tons, and this is projected to rise by 67% by 2030, with growth reaching nearly 100% in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So the so-called BRICS countries, so this is from Van Boekel in 2010. Why is so much antimicrobial used in animal food systems? So a few contributing factors. It's a contributing factor to the availability of cheap animal-sourced foods. It's used for growth promotion and disease prevention, and only secondarily used for actual disease treatment. Poor animal welfare conditions increase the need for antimicrobials in the first place, and a lack of access to pathogen-specific and animal-specific antimicrobials contribute to poor welfare, creating a vicious cycle. So what are the alternatives? Vaccines, improved biosecurity, better animal welfare, and better nutrition, all of which reduce the underlying need for routine antimicrobial use. So this is highly relevant to backyard and commercial hog and poultry raising across Davao region. So antibiotics are sometimes used not to treat sick animals but routinely to promote faster growth or prevent disease in crowded pens. Exactly the growth promotion driver described in this slide. So this connects directly to your earlier review of the Salmonella species study from Bangkirahan Public Marketplace. So antimicrobial exposed livestock and market environments are precisely where resistant strains can enter the human food chain. AMR doesn't stay contained on the farm or in the hospital, it spreads into the environment. Sources of antimicrobial pollution include pharmaceutical production, agricultural runoff, livestock manure used as fertilizer, and human waste. Large volumes of these antimicrobials enter waterways and other ecosystems. This exposes a wide range of microorganisms in the environment to antimicrobial resistant genetic material, increasing the likelihood of AMR emergence. So, and importantly, horizontal gene transfer, where bacteria pass resistance genes to each other, even across different species, occurs environmentally, not just inside a treated human or animal body. This image presented in the slide is sourced from Walsh in 2018. So, let me give you an example. Think about an untreated wastewater discharge from some piggery or poultry operations flowing into creeks that eventually reach the Davao River system or Davao Gulf. So manure used as fertilizer on nearby vegetable farms can carry resistant bacteria into the soil. and to produce sold in public markets. Our final slide on AMR asks the central policy question: how do we ensure antibiotic access for humans and livestock while reducing the drivers of AMR emergence? So this is the balancing act at the heart of AMR management. So managing AMR requires a One Health approach that considers several elements. So let me group them for you. First, prevention and monitoring tools, which includes biosecurity, surveillance, and drug research and discovery, including drugs tailored to specific pathogens to prevent overuse. Second, animal side improvements, improved animal welfare. Third, governance tools, regulation of pharmaceutical production, waste management, and sales. So we tackle the core problem, which is excessive and non-specific use. So fourth, equity considerations, ensuring access for public health, food security, and ecosystem health, not just for those who can pay. And fifth, the process itself, decision-making processes and actions across temporal and geographical scales, carried out in an inter- and transdisciplinary way. So I'll give you a mnemonic about AMR management. So we have BSDWRA, so which stands for Biosecurity, Surveillance, Drug Research and Development, Welfare Regulation, and Access. Okay, so hopefully that will help you to recall the 6 management levers, no, for managing AMR. Okay, so we now transition to our second major topic for this lesson, which is universal healthcare or UHC. While One Health focuses on the connection between humans, animals, and ecosystem, UHC focuses on ensuring that health services themselves reach everyone equitably. Okay, so let's begin. According to the World Health Organization framework illustrated here, universal healthcare means 5 things. 1. Ensuring all people have access to the health services they need. 2. No financial hardship when paying for them, meaning people shouldn't be pushed into poverty just because they got sick. 3. It encompasses the full spectrum of essential quality health services, not just emergency care. 4. It includes health promotion, prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and palliative care, the complete continuum from staying well to end of life care. And 5. It's recognized globally as a human right. Now, let's bring UHC home. How does the Philippines implement universal healthcare? What law governs it? And what are its practical mechanisms? So, this next set of slides will walk through the Philippine UHC law in detail. So, please take careful notes. Before we discuss the law itself, we need to understand why it was needed. So the Philippines faced, and in many ways still faces, 5 major health system challenges. First, a fragmented health system where services are scattered and poorly coordinated across different levels and providers. Second, high out-of-pocket or OOP expenses for healthcare, meaning Filipinos were paying a large share of medical costs directly from their own pockets rather than through insurance or government subsidy. Third, inequitable access to services, especially for the poor and those in remote or geographically isolated areas. Think of our island provinces and mountain regions. Fourth, underfunded public health facilities, which struggle with limited budgets, equipment, and supplies. And fifth, brain drain of health professionals. So many of our doctors, nurses, and medical technologies migrate abroad or move to the private sector due to better pay and working conditions. So, as future medical technologists, brain drain is directly relevant to your own career path. Many medtechs and nursing graduates from Davao and across Mindanao pursue opportunities abroad or in Metro Manila's private hospitals, which is part of why LGU run rural health units and even facilities like SPMC continually face staffing gaps in certain specialties. So the Philippine response to these challenges is Republic Act 11223, the Universal Healthcare Act, signed into law on February 20, 2019. Please remember this date. So its primary objective is to institutionalize universal healthcare for all Filipinos. So the law shifts our health system from a fragmented model to a more integrated and comprehensive one. And importantly, it aims to progressively realize healthcare as a right for every Filipino. So the word progressively is key because UHC is implemented in phases, not achieved overnight. RA 11223 is built on 5 core principles. First, equitable access. No one left behind regardless of socioeconomic status or location. Second, financial protection, reducing out-of-pocket expenses and catastrophic health spending. Third, quality services, ensuring health services are effective, safe, and people-centered. Fourth, efficiency, optimizing resource allocation and service delivery so resources aren't wasted. And fifth, accountability and transparency, promoting good governance in the health sector. One of the most significant mechanisms of RA 11223 is automatic membership. All Filipinos are automatically enrolled in the National Health Insurance Program or NHIP as either direct or indirect contributors. So direct contributors include employed individuals, self-earning professionals, overseas Filipino workers or OFWs, and similar groups who pay contributions themselves or through their employer. Indirect contributors include all indigent senior citizens, persons with disabilities or PWDs, and others who cannot pay contributions. These are subsidized by the government. The bottom line, and this is important, no Filipino will be denied access to health services due to lack of membership. This removes the old barrier when you needed to be an active paying PhilHealth member to access certain services. RA 11223 also restructures how health facilities work together through service delivery networks or SDNs. The law aims to integrate health facilities and providers into these formal networks, which are organized at the provincial and highly urbanized city or HUC level. So the purpose of SDNs is to ensure seamless referral systems and continuity of care. So a network includes primary care providers, hospitals, and specialized centers, all working together rather than operating as a disconnected, standalone facilities. So let me give you an example. So Davao City, it is a highly urbanized city, forms its own service delivery network, coordinating barangay health stations and city health centers with referral hospitals like SPMC and DRMC. So a patient with a suspected serious illness detected at a barangay health station should, in theory, have a clear seamless referral pathway up to SPMC. That is the SDN concept in practice. Under UHC, primary care is positioned as the foundation of the entire health system. So primary care is meant to be the immediate and accessible point of contact for every Filipino. So here's a key implementation detail. Every Filipino is assigned to a primary care provider. So this provider focuses on health promotion, disease prevention, early detection, and management of common illnesses. So primary care also serves as the gateway to specialized care, meaning ideally you see your primary provider first and then they refer you onward if you need a specialist rather than going straight to a tertiary hospital for every concern. For UHC to work, the entire health system needs strengthening, not just insurance coverage. So RA 11223 focuses on 4 areas. First, human resources for health or HRH, recruitment, retention, training, and distribution of health workers, which directly addresses that brain drain challenge we discussed earlier. Second, upgrading health facilities and equipment. Third, information systems and digital health transformation. Think electronic health records and telemedicine. Fourth, improve procurement of medicines and health products. So the so that essential drugs and supplies are consistently available. What do Filipinos actually receive under this law? Several concrete benefits, expanded PhilHealth benefits, a policy called no balance billing for indigents in public hospitals, meaning qualified indigent patients should not be charged any additional amount beyond what PhilHealth and government subsidies cover. Access to preventive, promotive, curative, rehabilitative, and palliative care, again, the full continuum. So the law also distinguishes between two service categories: population-based health services, things like immunization, health education, and screening, which are delivered to groups or communities as a whole, and individual-based health services such as consultations, diagnostics, and hospitalization delivered to a specific patient. So population-based services are the ones you will likely be most involved in as future medical technologists working in public health. For example, participating in mass screening programs like TB or HIV screening drives, no, conducted by the Davao City Health Office, versus individual-based services like running a diagnostic test ordered for one specific patient at a hospital laboratory. How is all of this paid for? UHC financing comes from several sources. Primary funding comes from PhilHealth contributions themselves, increased sin taxes on tobacco and alcohol serve as a significant additional funding source. This is a policy design that discourages harmful consumption while simultaneously funding health services. So annual appropriations from the General Appropriations Act or the GAA provide government budget support, and remittances from the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporations or PAGCOR and the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office or PCSO also contribute funding. The overall goal, of course, is to ensure sustainable and sufficient funding for the system long term. Let's now look at the three key institutional actors in the Philippine UHC, starting with the Department of Health or DOH. The DOH develops national health policies and standards, so it provides technical assistance to LGUs. It oversees the implementation of national health programs, it manages DOH hospitals and specialized centers, and it leads health emergency preparedness and response. So think of its role during typhoons, disease outbreaks, or other health emergencies. So let's say DOH Region 11, based here in Davao City, is the regional arm you will likely interact with directly, whether through TB DOTS programs, immunization campaigns, or outbreak response coordination with local city and provincial health offices across Davao. Next, PhilHealth. As the national health insurer, PhilHealth administers the National Health Insurance Program. It manages the collection of contributions and the disbursement of benefits. It accredits healthcare providers, meaning hospitals and clinics must meet PhilHealth standards to be able to claim reimbursements. It develops and reviews health benefit packages, deciding what conditions and procedures are covered and how much is reimbursed. So, and it also ensures the financial viability of the NHIP, meaning it has to manage the fund responsibly so it doesn't run out of money. Finally, the local government unit or LGU, arguably the most on the ground actor in this whole system. LGUs have the primary responsibility for delivering basic health services at the local level. So they manage local health facilities, rural health units, barangay health stations, and provincial hospitals. They allocate local funds for health. They implement national health programs adapted to local needs and contexts. So, and they are crucial for establishing and managing the service delivery networks we discussed earlier. So, to close our lesson, notice how DOH, PhilHealth, and LGUs each play distinct but interdependent roles. DOH set policy and national direction. PhilHealth manages financing and insurance, and LGUs handle actual service delivery on the ground. So this three-way partnership is what makes universal healthcare function in the Philippine context. Just as multi-sectoral collaboration is what makes One Health function, so both topics we covered today ultimately point to the same lesson. Health is never achieved by one actor working alone. It requires coordinated, interdependent systems. So thank you so much everyone. Have a wonderful day, good luck, and God bless.